the idea that forced humans to rethink knowing. For a long time, knowing meant possession. You either had the answer or you didn't. Then an idea arrived that broke that certainty. To understand why humans were forced to rethink knowing itself, we need to return to a moment when knowledge felt complete. Facts could be collected, proofs could be finished. Questions, once answered, were closed. To know something was to be done with it. This mattered because knowledge felt stable. Education was accumulation. Wisdom was storage. The more you knew, the safer you felt navigating the world. Ignorance was simply absence, waiting to be filled. The assumption was that every gap in understanding was temporary, a problem of insufficient effort or inadequate tools, rather than an inherent characteristic of knowledge itself. Then a disturbing idea emerged. It suggested that there were limits not just to what humans knew, but to what could be known at all. Not limits imposed by time or technology, but limits embedded in the structure of knowledge itself. The boundaries were not practical obstacles to be overcome. They were mathematical certainties to be acknowledged, not because of lack of effort or intelligence, but because of structure. Some truths could never be fully captured from within the system asking the questions. At first, this sounded abstract, philosophical, easy to ignore, but its implications were precise and unavoidable. It applied to logic, mathematics, and any system complex enough to describe itself. The implications were both precise and sweeping. Any formal framework rich enough to express basic arithmetic would necessarily contain truths it could not prove and questions it could not settle. Knowledge had boundaries that could not be crossed, not because of human limitations, but because of the mathematical structure of the systems within which knowledge was pursued. The limits were not practical. They were foundational. This was a turning point. Knowing stopped being about completion. It became about navigation, about understanding where certainty ends. And uncertainty is not a flaw, but a feature. Once this idea took hold, humans could no longer treat knowledge as something that simply grows toward perfection. It had limits, and those limits changed what it meant to know anything at all. The recognition that knowledge could never be complete, that there would always be truths beyond the reach of any formal system, transformed the entire enterprise of inquiry from a project of completion into a project of navigation. As this idea spread, it quietly destabilized confidence in absolute knowledge. If some truths could never be proven within a system, then certainty was no longer guaranteed by effort alone. More information did not always mean more understanding. This mattered because it reversed a long-held assumption. For centuries, humans believed ignorance was temporary. Every unanswered question felt solvable with enough time, data, or intelligence. The trajectory of knowledge seemed to point inevitably toward completeness, a horizon that receded as you approached it, but that was always assumed to be reachable in principle. Now, ignorance could be permanent by design. The unsettling part was precision. This was not a vague limit. It was exact. The boundary could be proven. Certain statements were true, yet unprovable. Others were consistent, yet undecidable. Knowledge could be correct and still unreachable. A statement could be true in every meaningful sense, consistent with all the axioms and all the evidence, and yet remain permanently beyond the capacity of the system to demonstrate. This was not a failure of effort. It was a feature of structure. At first, this felt paralyzing. If not everything could be known, what was the point of searching? If the edifice of knowledge was guaranteed to remain forever incomplete, did the pursuit of understanding still justify the enormous investment of human effort and intelligence it demanded? But the idea did not weaken knowledge. It reframed it. Knowing was no longer about completeness. It was about recognizing boundaries. This forced a change in how truth was valued. Proof became local, not universal. Certainty depended on assumptions. Every system rested on foundations it could not justify from within itself. The ground on which knowledge stood was revealed to be chosen rather than discovered, a starting point accepted by convention rather than proven by necessity. The conflict began here. Humans had to accept that reason had limits, and that those limits were not failures. They were structural, built into knowing itself. Knowledge had not collapsed. It had become honest. And honesty, unlike certainty, does not offer closure. It offers orientation. The conflict reached its peak when this idea collided with human expectation. People wanted knowledge to settle questions. Instead, it revealed questions that could never be settled. Certainty was no longer the default reward for inquiry. This is the emotional breaking point. The realization that effort does not guarantee closure, that intelligence does not guarantee completion, that some limits remain no matter how carefully one reasons. Mathematically, this was unavoidable. Any system rich enough to describe itself carried blind spots. Attempts to eliminate them only created new ones elsewhere. Knowledge could expand, but never seal itself shut. This created discomfort far beyond mathematics. If knowing had limits, then authority weakened. Final answers became suspect. Confidence required humility. The idea challenged not just what humans knew, but how they justified knowing. For some, this felt like loss. The dream of complete understanding faded. The vision of a finished edifice of knowledge, a structure in which every question had been answered and every relationship had been mapped, was revealed to be not merely ambitious, but logically impossible. For others, it felt like relief. The pressure to finish thinking was lifted. Exploration replaced conclusion. The recognition that knowledge could never be sealed shut liberated inquiry from the impossible standard of finality and redirected it toward the more sustainable and ultimately more productive goal of continuous deepening. The conflict was no longer between truth and error. It was between certainty and integrity, between believing knowledge should end and accepting that it never fully can. And in that tension, humans were forced to choose what kind of knowing they valued most. The resolution begins when knowing is redefined not as possession, but as relationship. Knowledge is no longer something held completely. It is something navigated, tested, and revised with awareness of its limits. This does not weaken understanding. It strengthens it. When limits are acknowledged, false certainty loses power. Inquiry becomes more careful. Confidence becomes grounded instead of absolute. The recognition that every conclusion rests on assumptions it cannot fully justify produces a humility that strengthens rather than weakens the enterprise of knowledge, because it guards against the overconfidence that has historically been the source of the most consequential intellectual errors. The deeper insight is freedom. Once humans stopped demanding that knowledge be complete, they could focus on what mattered. Progress no longer required final answers. It required honest movement within what could be known. The idea that forced humans to rethink knowing did not close doors. It clarified where the walls were. And clarity is not confinement. It is orientation. Knowing is no longer about reaching the end. It is about understanding where you stand, what assumptions you rely on, and which questions remain open by design. That shift did not end the pursuit of truth. It made it sustainable. By removing the expectation of completeness, the idea freed human inquiry to continue indefinitely, not as a frustrated pursuit of an unreachable goal, but as an open-ended exploration of a landscape that would always have more to reveal. Subscribe to join the journey.